This resurrection scene here in the 20th chapter of the Gospel of John really is one of the most interesting of all the resurrection narratives. We know this story. Earlier in this chapter, we find Jesus appearing in the upper room to the disciples. Thomas is not there. And so when the disciples tell Thomas that they have seen the risen Jesus, he doesn't believe it. He says, unless I see the nail prints in his hand and I see the spear hole in his side, I cannot believe. Well, a week later, Jesus comes back to the upper room. This time Thomas is with them, and Jesus reveals himself to Thomas and convinces Thomas that indeed he is the risen Jesus. It's about doubt and faith. That's our focus this morning, doubt and faith. What about those times that believers struggle with uncertainty, with doubt, wondering about what we believe and why we believe it? What I want to do this morning is answer that question with 5 insights. 5 insights on doubt and faith. First of all, Jesus doesn't condemn Thomas. That's important to note that. Jesus doesn't condemn Thomas. Not once in this scenario do you find Jesus using a harsh word or in any way castigating Thomas for his doubt. I think there are 2 reasons for that. First of all, Jesus knew Thomas. Now, the Thomas you and I know is the Thomas of this 20th chapter. But if you go back earlier in the book of John, in particular to the 11th chapter, you find a different Thomas. In that scene, Jesus tells the disciples that he's going to return to Bethany in order to raise Lazarus from the dead. And Bethany is just a few miles outside of Jerusalem. And so the disciples know that if Jesus returns near Jerusalem, he's in big trouble. And so when Jesus tells the disciples in the 11th chapter of the Gospel of John, I'm going to go to Bethany to raise Lazarus, they say to him, but Lord, they'll stone you. The minute that Jesus tells the disciples in that 11th chapter that he's going to go near Jerusalem, all of them but Thomas say, don't go, they're going to stone you. Thomas says, let us also go, that we may die with him. So the Thomas you and I find in the 20th chapter is a Thomas who seems to have doubts about the real Jesus, and yet the Thomas of the 11th chapter, whom Jesus knew dearly, is a Thomas who is committed to this Jesus. That's the first reason he didn't castigate him. Jesus knew the real Thomas. Knew his heart, knew his soul, knew his mind. But the more important reason that Jesus doesn't condemn Thomas is that Jesus knew that any one of us, listen to this very carefully, any one of us, under the right circumstances, can have moments of doubt. Any one of us. Jesus knew the Hebrew Scriptures. He knew the Hebrew stories. He knew all those characters of Hebrew tradition who, though servants of God, had at one time or another struggled with their faith. He remembered Elijah. Remember Elijah, the one who defeated the Baalite prophets on Mount Carmel, and then Queen Jezebel calls a hit on Elijah's life, and according to 2 Kings, Elijah runs off, goes and hides under a broom tree, and begs to die. Anything but faith. Jesus knew those Hebrew Scriptures. He knew those Hebrew stories. He knew that there had been many a great saint of God who at one time or another had doubted. But he also personally knew doubt. You do remember the scene on the cross, don't you, when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? You remember that, don't you? Do you realize that when Jesus said those words, he was quoting the 22nd Psalm? There he is on the cross, dying in anguish. And he chooses the 22nd Psalm to express what he's feeling. He didn't choose a psalm of faith. He didn't choose a psalm of hope. He didn't choose a psalm of courage. He could have chosen any psalm to express what he was feeling there on the cross. And instead, Jesus chose the 22nd Psalm. My God, why have you forsaken me? Translated, my God, why have you abandoned me? My God, why have you betrayed me? One Christian thinker reminds us that if any one of us believes that we will never have moments of doubt, we are elevating ourselves above the spirituality of Jesus. That's pretty telling. If we say that we will never, ever have doubt, then we are elevating ourselves above the spirituality of Jesus, because Jesus himself on the cross knew doubt. So the first truth is, Jesus didn't condemn Thomas because Jesus knew his heart, and Jesus knew that any one of us, under the right circumstances, can doubt, struggle. Secondly, some doubt comes from life experiences. Some very real doubt comes from life experiences. One of my favorite people on earth is Jane Goodall. You know Jane Goodall, the woman who in 1960, at age 26, went to Tanzania and began to work among the chimpanzees, and there launched a wonderful journey of being a caretaker of Earth's animals and of creation. She's now 80 years old. I just love that woman, Jane Goodall. I don't know if you've read her autobiography or not. It's titled A Reason for Hope, A Spiritual Journey. And in that, Jane Goodall talks about the struggle she and her husband Derek had before he died with his deeply painful cancer. And here's what she writes. What we went through with Derek's cancer was horrendous. The gradual increase of pain, the injections at night instead of the pills. Oh, the horror of it. Hell on earth. Suffering for the suffering of one I loved ever more deeply with each passing day. The misery, the anguish, the hoping, praying, desperately seeking a way to cope, damning myself for failure, praying. I was haunted by the last words he ever spoke. I didn't know such pain was possible. I was grieving, suffering, and angry. Angry at God, angry at fate, angry at the injustice of it all. And so for a while after Derek's death, I rejected God. Would anyone in this sanctuary dare say that you wouldn't feel the same way? Would any of us in this sanctuary, preachers included, dare say that under the right circumstances we might not struggle with our relationship with God and even be angry at God? You do understand, don't you, that God's okay with that? You do understand that God made us the way we are? He gave us these feelings. He gave us these emotions. He gives us minds to think about things even when we're suffering. Sometimes life is so hard and so cruel and so painful that some people can't help but struggle with their faith. And God understands that. Which leads me to a corollary truth. Some doubt comes from life's inequities. Some doubt comes from life's very real inequities. When I was pastoring in Murray prior to coming here to Germantown, I met Joshua. Joshua is one of the lost boys of the Sudan. You do know that story, don't you? I was reminded about Joshua in reading an article in the Commercial Appeal this past week about Luau Ding. Luau Ding is 32 years old. He's a senior at Lemoyne-Owen College. He's one of the lost boys of the Sudan. Let me remind you of that story. This is in the 1980s. There's civil war in the Sudan. And Luau Ding says this about the day that he ran into the jungle at 5 years of age. Now, you really have to pay attention to the depth of this story. In 1987, I was playing in the backyard when the army approached our village. I was 5 years old. My mother told me to run into the jungle. At first, I refused because I didn't want to leave my mother, but she said, "Run, son, run to save your life." And so I ran. And so did 26,000 children between the ages of 4 and 11. I have a 5-year-old grandson. I cannot imagine that grandson running into the jungle without a parent. 26,000 children, ages 4 to 11, ran into the jungle. Many were readily devoured by lions or tigers or hyenas. Some starved to death. They trekked 1,000 miles, 4 to 11, through the jungle, into the desert. They trekked 1,000 miles to Ethiopia and went into a refugee camp in Ethiopia. And then war broke out in Ethiopia, and they headed back to the Sudan the same 1,000 miles. In 1992, when finally there was refuge for those lost boys of the Sudan, there were 3,600 left. In 3 to 4 years, 22,400 children ages 4 to 11 had gone into the jungle because of the violence in the Sudan, eaten by lions, eaten by tigers, eaten by hyenas, starving to death, violence all around. 22,400 children ages 4 to 11 died horribly. Listen to me. We do God no favors, as I've said before, nor the Christian faith any favors if we minimize the hard questions of life about suffering in this world. People have a right to ask, how can a good God, a loving God, a compassionate God allow 22,400 children ages 4 to 11 die so horribly? How can He? Some doubt comes because when you look at the real world and the inequities in this world, and the hard question is asked, where is a loving God in the midst of that? Some people naturally struggle. And God understands. Fourth thing, the church needs to accept strugglers and doubters. We need to be a community that accepts strugglers and doubters. We need people who are honest with their questions. Let me tell you why. First of all, we will never connect with the disconnected if we're not listening. There is no way in the world we who gather regularly in the community of faith are going to connect with those who are disconnected from the church if we're not going to listen to their questions and their challenges and their doubts. We need them. They need us, but we need them. Why do we need them? Because they will tell us, show us how to connect with the disconnected of this world. Secondly, they remind us that none of us have our act together. You know, if we hung a sign outside the door of this church that said, if you've got your act together, come into worship, I'd be preaching to an empty audience. Well, in fact, I wouldn't be here. If we had a sign, you got your act together, you got all the questions answered, you got it all solved, you're spiritually secure, we hang that sign out around here, we might as well just shut the place down. Because they remind us that we too are trying to get our act together, that we've got some growth. Third reason is, it's what it means to be a loving church. It's what it means to be the body of Christ. That the person with the deepest questions in his or her life, the deepest doubts, is as welcome in this place as I am and as you are. Because this is the body of Jesus. And everybody's welcome. Strugglers and doubters need to be welcome in this place. You know the name Adam Hamilton. I've mentioned before, you know him. He's pastor of the largest Methodist church in the world, or certainly in this country, Church of the Resurrection in Kansas City. You've read some of his books. In his book, Seeing Gray in the World of Black and White, he tells about the time that his teenage daughter at a church camp announced that she wasn't a Christian. Now, as a senior pastor, I can appreciate what that would feel like. Church camp. Daughter announced this to the counselors, I'm not a Christian. Everybody knows that she's the daughter of Adam Hamilton, who's the pastor of the largest Methodist church in this country. I'm not one of those. I'm not like him. And Adam Hamilton admits in his book that he struggled with a sense of failure, that he had failed his daughter. He struggled with his own self-esteem. How do you preach to a congregation when they know that your daughter has said, I'm not a Christian? And he said, I prayed for two things: patience and understanding. That's what we need to do. We need to be patient and understanding with those who struggle with the faith, whose experiences in life, whose questions about life we need to hear. And together we need to walk the journey towards some answers. But without patience and understanding, they're not going to walk through that door. are they? And finally this. In the end, however, it is faith. In the end, we are a people of faith. I don't know if you know the name A.J. Cronin or not. A.J. Cronin is one of the world's renowned physicists. He's won the Nobel Prize in physics. He's a professor at the University of Chicago. Again, one of the most noted physicists in the world. His pastor writes about the time that A.J. Cronin was at his daughter's wedding, and he toasted the daughter and son-in-law. And he toasted the daughter and son-in-law with these words. Now again, this is one of the world's renowned physicists. And here's how he toasted his daughter and son-in-law. Cupid took his bow and shot an arrow into the air and brought you two together. And what the pastor notes is that there was no analysis of the trajectory of the arrow. No discussion about the velocity of the arrow going from Cupid into the hearts of that daughter and son-in-law. No scientific measure of whether or not you talk about Cupid shooting an arrow into our hearts so we can fall in love. Because that scientist knew you can't explain love. Can you? You can use words, I can use words, but the truth is there's not a way to explain to somebody unless they experience love what love really is. There is no answer that you can certainly tell somebody what love is scientifically. It just happens. We believe some other things that way. In fact, the best things of life are a matter of faith. You can't prove the resurrection. But I believe the resurrection. You believe the resurrection. You can't prove that your prayers work. You can tell somebody all day you're praying for them, but you cannot for one moment prove to somebody that the prayers you're praying make a difference. But you believe they do. And I believe they do. You cannot prove that God is at work for good in your life. You can quote Romans 8:28 all day long. But you cannot prove that God works for good in your life or in mine. But you believe it, and I believe it. You cannot prove that those serendipitous, inexplicable moments that happen in your life that bring good to you are from God. Aren't they just accidents? You can't prove they're from God, but you believe it. You can't prove there's life after death. You can try all day long to prove there's life after death, but you can't prove it. But you believe it. In the end, we say that we believe not because we have seen, but simply because we believe. So what I want us to remember this morning, on doubt in faith. Jesus didn't condemn Thomas, and he doesn't condemn anyone who doubts, because any person in the right circumstances can struggle with his or her faith, even the best of us. And some doubt comes from life experiences. Some doubt comes from the inequities of life, the tragic suffering of life. Some people struggle because of life's experiences. And we need to be the community that hangs a sign up that says, "Welcome here with all your questions." And we'll find answers together. Welcome you doubters. Welcome you strugglers to Germantown United Methodist Church. We're a people of faith. We believe, but we welcome you even in your unbelief. Thanks be to God. Amen. I'll call your attention now.